me, Marty Walsh, and today we will talk about 1968. It was a wacky election with many twists and turns. Let's see how the Republicans did. Going into the primaries, the clear frontrunner was former Vice President and 1960 Republican nominee Richard Milhous Nixon. That's not to say he did not face opposition. However, most of his opposition was a candidate who would be popular for a while, then they would drop out. The first major challenger Nixon would have to face was the legend himself, George W. Romney, governor of Michigan and father of Mitt Romney. In mid-1967, a poll came out with Nixon at 37% and Romney at 25%, which wasn't too bad considering who Romney was running against. However, Romney said dumb things, such as that he had been previously brainwashed into supporting the Vietnam War. After this, Romney's campaign began to fade away and he withdrew in late February. In early March, Nixon would dominate in the New Hampshire primary with 78% of the vote. However, anti-war Republicans would write in rich Uncle Pennybags himself, New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller, for the primary, and he received 11%. Not bad. Rockefeller almost ran against Nixon in 1960 but didn't, and was almost the nominee in 1964, so another run seemed like the right idea. Despite being the leader of the liberal wing in the Republican Party, Rockefeller consistently lost to Nixon in primaries and polls alike. Rockefeller did win the Massachusetts primary, but that was it. It looked like smooth sailing for Nixon until his next opponent showed up, the leader of the conservative wing of the party, the big man himself, Ronald Reagan, governor of California, emerged as Nixon's new opponent. While Nixon continued to win primary after primary, Reagan remained the leading challenger to Nixon's nomination. Reagan was able to finally clinch a victory in California, and with that win, he also claimed the majority of the popular vote in the Republican primary that year. The Republican National Convention was held from August 5th to 8th in Miami, Florida. Nixon won the nomination with 692 delegates, Rockefeller came in second with 277 delegates, and Reagan came in third with 182 delegates. The Republicans nominated Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as their vice presidential candidate. But what about the Democrats? Before I start explaining about their primary, it was very intricate, so please try and follow along. Initially, President Lyndon B. Johnson sought re-election and his party's renomination. However, many voters and people in general were pissed with Johnson and his handling of the Vietnam War. By this point, most people wanted an end to the war, and Johnson kept up the war effort. Johnson was also concerned about his former Attorney General and now New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy running against him because of his high popularity and name recognition. But another candidate was already challenging Johnson. Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy was a rising star in the primaries. An anti-war candidate, McCarthy appealed to younger voters and was becoming a threat to Johnson's candidacy. The New Hampshire primary took place on March 12th, and despite Johnson's 49% victory, McCarthy came in a relatively close second place with 42%, thus putting himself on the map as a legitimate candidate. In a surprise move, 4 days later, Robert F. Kennedy announced his presidential run, thus worsening the situation for Johnson. McCarthy won most of the early primaries and was beating Johnson easily in most polls. Facing health problems and more losses ahead, at the end of March, Johnson dropped out of the race. With Johnson's withdrawal, the New Deal coalition effectively broke down into support for four candidates. Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey, who announced his candidacy in late April, was the candidate with the support of the Democrat establishment and unions. Senator Eugene McCarthy, who had support of college students, intellectuals, and the anti-war movement. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who had support of minorities, the poor, Catholics, and other ethnic minorities, and a fourth group that rallied around the conservative segregationist Alabama governor George Wallace, but we'll get to him later. Humphrey didn't compete in the primaries directly, rather he had several surrogate candidates that often just competed in their home states to give Humphrey their delegates. The race was neck and neck between Kennedy and McCarthy, especially after Kennedy edged McCarthy out in Indiana.
My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart."
And McCarthy upset Kennedy in Oregon. The next primaries were in California, South Dakota, and in New Jersey. Kennedy beat McCarthy 46% to 42% in California, as well as in South Dakota. McCarthy won New Jersey and made it clear that he would challenge Kennedy in New York, where there was support from anti-war activists. After giving his victory speech, Kennedy was shot by a Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan, who was pissed about Kennedy's support for Israel. Soon after Kennedy's death, George McGovern, senator from South Dakota and a Kennedy supporter, announced he would run for the Democratic nomination. He tried to rally Kennedy supporters and delegates, but it really didn't work. The 1968 Democratic Convention was held from August 26th to 29th in Chicago, Illinois, and it was one of the most tumultuous of its kind. There were anti-war protesters outside the convention, and the Chicago police force used brutal means to subdue them, all while the protesters shouted, "The world is watching!" In the end, Humphrey won the nomination with 1,759.25 delegates, McCarthy in second place with 601 delegates, and McGovern in third with 146.5 delegates. The Democrats nominated Maine Senator Edmund Muskie as vice president, but there was also a third party. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, banning racial segregation. Some people were pretty angry about this and split from the Democrats over it. One prominent politician who split from the Democrats over segregation,
and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever,
was Alabama Governor George Wallace, who ended up becoming the nominee for the American Independent Party. Wallace wasn't aiming to win. His run was meant to cause a deadlock in the Electoral College and force the election to go to the House of Representatives. The American Independent Party nominated retired four-star General Curtis LeMay as vice president, but the general election will be very close.
Vamos a la playa, a mí me gusta bailar.
Wallace ended up climbing to around 21% in polls, while Humphrey lagged behind Nixon in most polls. Wallace had been taking away most of his voters from Humphrey, who many people associated with the Johnson administration. To most people, the writing was on the wall. The Democratic New Deal coalition was falling apart, the South had been lost, and Humphrey was bound to lose. Then, something happened. Humphrey got a little muscle in his pants and attempted a rebound. He set his sights on George Wallace, calling him a racist bigot. Unions that supported Humphrey managed to bring back unions from supporting Wallace. All this combined with the fact that Wallace's running mate was suggesting the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam killed Wallace's momentum and gave Humphrey an edge. Humphrey then distanced himself from the Johnson administration and called for a bombing halt in Vietnam. Shortly after, President Johnson ordered a bombing halt and even a possible peace deal, known as the Halloween Peace. This gave Humphrey a well-needed boost against Nixon. Nixon stopped the peace deal from taking place, drawing anger from Democrats and even some Republicans. But who would win? And Richard Nixon won by an extremely close margin against Humphrey. Nixon won with 301 electoral votes, Humphrey won 191 electoral votes, and Wallace managed to win 46 electoral votes. Despite this, Nixon garnered only 43.4% of the popular vote, followed by Humphrey's 42.7%, and lastly with Wallace's 13.5%. As of the 2016 presidential election, Wallace is the last third-party candidate to carry a state. Nixon will be inaugurated on January 20th, 1969, as the 37th president. Spiro Agnew became the 39th vice president. Thank you for watching. I do not know what next election is.